Hey, this is Jay Watts from Merely Human Ministries. Welcome to the Human Things Podcast, Season 3, Episode 4.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
All right, we're on. Welcome to the Human Things Podcast. We press on. I think I had said that this is going to be the episode on just war theory. I had to push that one off because my guest wanted time to prep and schedule issues. So basically, we're going to have a lot of guests for the rest of the season because everybody kept asking to have a little bit more time to prep. They're very intimidated by the intelligence of our audience, I guess, of the people who listen to. I have no idea why. It's like, just come and talk. But people want time to prep. They want to be prepared to come in. So we're going to have a guest-heavy run after this one. So because of that, there was some things to talk about. There are things to talk about. The main focus today is actually going to be, I wanted to focus a little bit on the Arizona law, the 1864 Arizona law that we've heard so much about, that the Supreme Court of Arizona ruled that a law passed in 1864 pertaining to abortion can be put in place. And the world freaked out because this law was written in 1864. And so we're going to talk about that. And we're going to talk about it in context a little bit less about it. That is so much less interesting than you probably think it is. When you say that there's an 1864 law that's going to be on the books and apply to people today, it sounds insane. And maybe to some people it is insane. But what I want to do is give a little bit more clarity on why it's not terribly insane. Of course, it will make people who love abortion crazy mad. And by the way, in saying this, in the same way the Arizona Supreme Court said it, I'm not even endorsing the law or I think it's a good idea. I'm just saying it's not crazy. That's all. And that there's a flaw in how we've approached this and a reason why the optics of it are far worse than the reality of it. But what happened was when I was looking into it and I said that this is not even a terribly interesting conversation that'll take a very long time, we're actually going to end up responding a little bit to John Oliver from HBO. And This Week Tonight, I think, is the name of his show. John Oliver is a guy that I think is really funny. I also think he is sometimes not. I used to think he was so well informed. One of the things about John Oliver's shtick, and we'll get to it more later, but I'll just touch on this right now. His shtick is that he does research on a particular subject. So instead of having a news show where he talks about multiple different things, he usually covers a couple of things early, and then most of his show is focused on one subject matter. And he gives the I want to say illusion, but sometimes there is the illusion to it being very well researched. I used to think more highly of the information that he was giving until a few times I heard him talk about things I happen to know a lot more than he does about and realized he's a very superficial, or his research staff or whoever is responsible, very superficial, obviously viewpoint issues. I mean, he comes into it with his own view on these issues, but the fact that he has such strong positions before they do the research obviously colors the way that they end up presenting the information. And outrageously so sometimes. He says things that just are unsupported. But because I think he is probably the best of that kind of person and how he handles material, I want to interact with the way he's presented abortion a couple of times at that point. So we'll do Arizona and John Oliver kind of all together because that's how I got started. Somebody said, in all seriousness, that I ought to check out John Oliver's view on this because it was incredibly informative. And so I watched John Oliver's view on all of this and walked away from it saying, he's funny, as always. He's polished, as always. And I really do like him, even though he says things that I find outrageously wrong and sometimes I think reckless. I really think he's funny and I enjoy his show. It's just, he drives me crazy with some of the things that he says. So we're going to interact a little bit with him later. What I want to start off with, I have no animal news today. I have no, in a world where Beyonce has released a country album that was #1 on the charts and Taylor Swift dropped her new album. What is it? I can't remember the name of. It's something like, Tortured Poets or something like that. I just don't listen to that stuff. So I have nothing to say about music right now. And nothing can top to me what I thought was the most. If you've been following the drama at NPR, and that's not what we're going to be talking about, but a reporter for NPR published an article or an op-ed where he said that NPR used to be for everyone, and now it has become very culturally driven by a leftist progressive agenda. It's not balanced. It's lost its audience. It's lost its purpose. And he was predictably let go. Well, he wasn't he was suspended without pay, and then he resigned. And he said that the current CEO of NPR is in over her head, that she doesn't know what she's not the woman for the job. And this guy, by the way, is not a particularly conservative guy in any way. I mean, he's not conservative by any definition. He just thinks that they lost their way. And he points to the fact that the person who's in charge of NPR has, over many years, posted some very strange, sometimes very powerfully leftist or progressive tweets demonstrating a very, very strong commitment to a certain political slant. And one of them, the weirdest of them to me, was her because I would never tweet something like this. She tweeted that she had a dream that she and Kamala Harris were holding hands and walking together somewhere. And so that was just bizarre to me. So, but one of the things that I reflected on with the NPR thing was that I used to listen to NPR a lot more. I've always felt like it was center left. Never felt like it was center or center right. I always felt like it was center left. But when I used to drive a lot for work, in the sense that before I was ever in ministry or ever did anything like this, I would drive, and sometimes my drive would take anywhere from an hour to 2 hours in Atlanta traffic, depending on how it was, every single day, each way. And so when you drive that much, particularly at the end of a work day, I wasn't the greatest at being able to keep my energy up on that drive home. I'd had a long, exhausting day. I was tired. So I was looking for ways to keep engaged mentally, and talk radio just does not do it for me, man. I just cannot handle listening to people yell at each other all the time. There's no allure to it. And there was something intoxicating for me about the melodic liberalism of NPR. I loved it. And so I listened to NPR all the time. I would say that during that period, I was remarkably well informed too about what was going on in the world, because I had these long stretches of listening to NPR both in the morning. And then when I would drive to other parts of the state, I knew every place where NPR, where it was on the dial. So as I would leave one, I would be able to dial it into the next, and there would be different shows, and some of them would have classical music. So I loved NPR, but there was a period where I just got tired of it feeling like it was one viewpoint constantly being harassed. So long before this guy wrote this article, I left NPR and I'm listening to BBC now. I haven't listened to BBC radio. Same reason, because I just need that kind of middle engagement. And I'll always listen to BBC radio when I drive all the way across the country. I because of my daughter's lacrosse schedule, I routinely drive from Georgia to places like New Jersey or Maryland or Pennsylvania. And so when I do those drives, because I just can't afford to fly all over the country on my ministry budget, when I do those drives with her in our Toyota Corolla, she sleeps a good portion of the way. I leave at 3:00 in the morning, and I listen to BBC radio most of the way until she wakes up, and then she takes over and starts playing her music. So what I heard on BBC today, which I think is great, in the sense of this is just a perfect picture of how stupid our country is right now. So apparently our president, Joseph Robino Biden, is that his middle name? I think his name is like Robino or something like that. He was speaking at a steel mill last week, I believe, is the setup for this. And in his talk, he was, for some reason that seems to have nothing to do whatsoever with where he was or what was going on, he started to reflect on his uncle, Ambrose Finnegan, who was a pilot in World War II. And as Joe Biden shares the story, he was shot down over Papua New Guinea, and his body was never found because he was eaten by cannibals. Okay. I love our president in the sense that, look, I love sitting around talking to people that just tell stories, man. And I could sit around and talk to Uncle Joe about popcorn and cannibals in Papua New Guinea, and the speeches that he stole from British politicians, or his fake grades, or his fake accomplishments, or all the things that this guy will just tell stories about it. But he is president of the United States, and he is talking to a group of people about how his uncle was eaten by cannibals in Papua New Guinea. Unsurprisingly, the people of Papua New Guinea are not happy about this. Apparently, it was the social media. I'm sorry. It blew up on social media there. They're outraged at the president of the United States. And he says, like, no, seriously. He's like, no, seriously, there were cannibals and they probably ate my uncle. So the prime minister of Papua New Guinea, James Marape, has gone on had to publicly comment that he feels like he probably just misspoke. And then another guy who's an expert on Papua New Guinea and a scholar in that area, and a citizen of Papua New Guinea, spoke out and said, look, the people of Papua New Guinea are very upset about this, and they feel like the president of the United States needs to apologize for characterizing us as cannibals who ate his uncle. I'm sorry. And they're mad at their prime minister because he won't stand up for the country. And it's serious. I'm sorry. It is so serious because there are strategic value and partnerships in the Pacific and what's going on right now, where Papua New Guinea is located at the same time that Joe Biden is speculating that they hate his uncle in World War II. China is courting them and making treaties and deals with them so that they have economic relationships with them to build them as a platform to be used as part of their strategic alliances in that region. And so, again, you know, and this is all on the BBC. When you hear other countries talk about what's going on in our country right now, it's not encouraging. It doesn't give us a good look as far as where we are politically and the leadership that we're choosing across the board to represent us. Eventually you get the leadership you deserve in our kind of a country. So I just wanted to share that. I apologize for losing it, but I just the idea, and the guy, the funniest part was, there's so many things about this are funny, but the guy who was being critical of Prime Minister James Marape for standing up for Biden, or at least giving Biden an excuse. He's saying, look, he probably just misspoke, or it might have been a poor joke. But this scholar, whose name I didn't write down, said, no, because he said this more than once. He didn't misspoke. He's told this story publicly multiple times now. So he said, it's our prime minister's job to defend Joe Biden for calling us cannibals. He should be demanding an apology from the president of the United States for characterizing our country as people who ate his uncle when he crash landed in World War II, which I think, by the way, is perfectly reasonable. I think that the president of the United States does owe the people of Papua New Guinea an apology for characterizing them that way. I wish we could say that this could be just written off to the fact that he's old, but he's been saying this kind of stupid stuff his entire life. Okay, let's move on. All right, something different, something entirely different. The terms conservative, progressive, I have a hard time figuring out what to call people nowadays. I'll be honest, because I don't think that I think terms like evangelical, I think terms like conservative, I think terms like progressive, leftist, all of that stuff, I'm not sure anybody has any idea what it means anymore. I remember when I was younger, there was a clear political, and there was a political line of ideology, and you fell either on the left or the right, and the right tended towards complete anarchy on one side, and then limited government and libertarianism, and then you got to conservatism, and then you crossed, and so you went towards more government involvement, and then the government seizes the means of production, socialism, communism. Ultimately, you're heading on the left side towards authoritarianism. As you go from no law all the way over to the left, where all law is held by one person. right? And so those are the extremes that I grew up understanding the political spectrum. If you go and look up the political spectrum right now, it's impossible to get a clear picture of what anybody means. I've actually checked about 3 or 4 different scholars to see try to see how they defend it, because they want to be able to say, well, right's fascist, and so fascism shows up in the right, which is a more amount of controls, but traditionally would have been understood when I was a kid on the left side of things, because right was tending towards less government and left was tending towards more government control. But because they think of the right as being more authoritarian for particular reasons, it just doesn't. The left-right divide makes no sense anymore. And because I believe in the specificity of language, which is my key problem with when we start talking about discussions, when I read articles about transgender athletes, trans male, trans female, whatever. My key problem, and less the problem. All right, let's be clear. Less the problem of that. I mean, that's a whole other problem. We can discuss at another show, and I'd be happy to. I'm not afraid of the discussion. I was talking to somebody about this recently when they were bringing up pronouns. That's the problem I have with the pronoun, that more than the transgender stuff. The pronoun issue is it's confusing. It's not clarifying. Language is meant to be at its best clarifying. We use language, very specific language, more and more sophisticated language, so that we can understand concepts better and communicate them more clearly. And now that language has been co-opted to entertain the emotions or feelings of the people who are using it to say, if you call me this, I will feel better, even if that's not accurate or it has no connection whatsoever with anything that's helpful to your audience, you still have to use it as a means to making me feel more accepted or included, or however you want to use that. The problem is that that's just not what language's job is. Language's job is not to make you feel better. It's to be clear. Now, sometimes people can use language that in and of itself clearly communicates to us something about them. Have you ever sat down and talked to an outright racist, and they will use certain language? And I had an argument about this one time with a magazine editor about an article that I was writing where we were discussing free speech, where I said, I am a free speech guy, 100% love free speech. And he started to talk about what he would call far-right ideas. Again, I find those not helpful language-wise, but he was talking about Nazism and racism and things of that nature. And he said, we shouldn't give them the right to communicate to people because their ideas are so dangerous and infectious. And I said, I believe the opposite is true. I think that by letting them talk, we are able to identify them more clearly and then ostracize those ideas as they ought to be ostracized. You can say whatever hateful, stupid thing that you want, and then understand that there will be repercussions for saying that in the community, the broader community around. And then we may disagree with what's hateful and what's not hateful. And those are the kind of things that we ought to be arguing about in the public sector. We should not be hiding from these things to save people's feelings. We should be confronting them full on. So we can say, we all agree that this is terrible. Some of us don't seem to think this is terrible. There's a broad disagreement on this. So let's argue about this if it's impinging on our ability to move forward. Okay. So that's why I think that kind of particular language is not helpful. And so I was reading Edmund Burke. I got the book here, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that I found most interesting about Edmund Burke and his writing on it is that I think he gives at the outset, and he would be considered a father of sort of conservatism in thought. Edmund Burke, a British politician and political philosopher who wrote at the time of this, he's writing about the French Revolution in 1789. So he's discussing the ideas that took over France and its execution. And because he believes in a kind of freedom, he's being asked to respond to this in a series of letters, and he's responding back, sharing his ideas. And in this, he gives what I think is a great defense and definition of what is meant by conservatism in the sense of what I have always considered conservatism. Not the political conservatism of today, because I'm not even sure what that is, but principled conservatism as it's been defended by thinkers like Edmund Burke. And I don't want to give the impression that I think Edmund Burke's a perfect thinker, a perfect writer. I mean, he's not. Just like everybody who writes in certain periods. He's sort of effortlessly anti-Semitic at certain points of his writing. It's bizarre. And he would, by the way, he would say in his own writings at different times that he was not, and he defended the rights of the Jewish people in England. But there's sort of, and Dickens did the same thing, and Oliver Twist. You see some of these are both, let's say, you see Charles Dickens and Edmund Burke are two people that demonstrate both an outward spoken disavowal of anti-Semitism, but at the same time, their language communicated sort of what I said, an effortless anti-Semitism, which means it must have been so accepted by society at large for them to talk in the terms that they were talking that they didn't even notice that they had crossed lines and were saying horrible things about Jewish citizens of England. And they both would have believed themselves to be supporters of and actively were and had Jewish supporters themselves. But that's always a key to me. I was talking to my kids. Anti-Semitism is so bizarrely present in so many different societies that even people who seem otherwise clear in their thinking seem to sort of effortlessly drop these anti-Semitic comments, which is an indictment on the world that they lived in as much as anything else, when you can just say ugly things about Jewish people without having any concern whatsoever about what just came out of your mouth. All of that said, let's get on to his defense of principled conservatism. He talks about this idea of you see the perfect foil for it in what happened in France. I don't know how much most people are familiar with what happened during the French Revolution, but it was a complete and total abandonment of the culture that existed prior because of the evils of that culture. There were inexcusable injustices and evils in the French culture. But Edmund Burke says, here's the problem. When that existed in England and we had our bloodless revolution, we saw that all the things that predated us, we evaluated the changes that we wanted to make based on the idea that there's a reason that these things have been passed from generation to generation. There's a reason these institutions have existed from generation to generation. So as we take this moment to make corrections, let's do it through the lens of understanding that the wisdom of generations and what has been brought to us is not worthless. As a matter of fact, it's of value. But there are aspects of it that need to be abandoned as we move forward and make a better world. And so let's change what must be changed without a wholesale abandonment of who we were or all of the things that were brought to us. And he said that was how we handled our revolution in England. This is how the revolution in France is being handled, is that you've abandoned everything that you were in the belief that everything that predated you was flawed, so that you can then create this new society. And I mean, they got rid of everything. If you studied them, they were so committed to this that they moved to metric time and calendars, that they were trying to change the way they measured time and measured dates. They were going to give up everything that had existed prior to them and bring into existence this new way of understanding the entire world. They saw everything that came before them as something that was flawed. And in that sense, he says he abandoned. So he gives us a defense of the idea of conservatism in the sense that he says, hey, look, all we're doing is making sure that, he says, like in this on page 30, thus by preserving the method of nature and the conduct of the state and what we improve, we are never wholly new in what we retain, and we're never wholly new, and in what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. That's after him talking about this idea of we have an entailed inheritance. He said a spirit of innovation is generally the result of a selfish temper and confined views. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. Besides, the people of England well know that the idea of inheritance furnishes a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission, without at all excluding a principle of improvement. It leaves acquisition free, but it secures what it acquires. Whatever advantages are obtained by a state proceeding on these maxims are locked fast in a sort of family settlement, grasped as in a kind of mortmain forever by a constitutional policy working after the pattern of nature. We receive, we hold, we transmit our government and our privileges in the same manner in which we enjoy and transmit property and our lives. He says, because we have this pattern of the transmission of what's important, secured through generations of knowledge and culture. He said, when we add something new, it's added to that system, which will secure the new thing to the next generation. Changes take root greater in this conservative understanding of change. He says there's a selfishness to the idea that things have to be changed and it has to be balanced against the past and all that came before us. We can't take this moment to decide that every generation that came before us was less than us and we're greater than them, because they've given us a system of passing down and transmission of values and property and culture and government and all of the stability that comes with it. So he said, when we see necessary change, we add it to the system that's already existed. And that's when he says, that's by preserving the method of nature and the conduct of the state. And what we improve, we are never wholly new. And what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete. That we'd never give up who we were completely, but we see the failure on particular areas. And when we add it to what's already existed before we got there, we assure its transmission because it's put into a system that is designed to transmit values and things to the next generation. And he says in his condemnation of France, you had all these advantages in your ancient states, but you chose to act as if you had never been molded into civil society and had everything to begin anew. You began ill because you began by despising everything that belonged to you. You set up your trade without a capital. And this is the warning for him of the idea of what happened in France, in the sense of you had, and he even says in his writings, he thinks they had a richer history than any other group of people that have ever existed. He said you had those resources that you could have called on to make these great changes and to make the world a better place. But because you began by believing that everything about what came before you was wrong, you birthed this new world into an unrestricted environment where it ran crazy. And that's why we get, in Edmund Burke's mind, the reign of terror. He said you had people who were ill-equipped to lead, who didn't understand government, who had no understanding how to make and how to secure a lasting enterprise, and you just let them loose with this idea that the only thing that mattered was that we destroyed the past. So France exists then as the ultimate example of what goes wrong when you let loose this concept of pure, unadulterated progressivism and releasing yourself from all burdens of the past so that you can begin anew and create something that has never existed before with only condemnation and hatred for where we came from. So the danger in that is that the institutions that made it possible for us to get here as a civil society are abandoned as well. And all that's left after that is chaos. And people who have no investment in getting things to the next generation and no idea how to do that and no idea how to make a civil society. And that is such a great definition of conservatism. It's not the idea that we don't want change. If that's what you think conservatism is, whether you call yourself a conservative because you want things to stay the same, that is not what Edmund Burke would say conservatism is. It's not saying I want things to stay the same. All it's saying is that the world that was given to me by people who fought very hard to give us the best that they possibly could. And the flaws that are in that world need to be addressed without abandoning all of the things that are good about what was given to us out of this need to condemn the past, at the same time elevate myself as better than it. Let me just say this. I have always said I think Twitter is a cesspool of stupidity. I think Threads is just carrying that on. And I don't understand why people waste their time on it. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why. But when in 2017, I think it was, there was an article, and I'll give it so this can be linked underneath in our podcast. In 2017, I think there was an article about they did psychological profile on people who are leaving comments and social media comment threads, who are getting into arguments, into all of these things. Twitter. Now, Threads didn't exist back then, but now it does. And they said what they determined was that the people who are most active and the most aggressive tend to show signs of psychopathy. So they're psychopaths, narcissism, personality disorders. You have people that are online who are just arguing for the sake of hurting other people. And so when I see this arrogance about how we are better, while at the same time a complete and total ignorance about anything about history. And I'm going to give you an example of this that has nothing to do with politics or history, but just to show you what I mean by this kind of thinking. I was at a lacrosse game and I was watching my daughter officiate a lacrosse game. My daughter was trained as an official. She's officialed a bunch of lacrosse games. She knows the rules. We talk about lacrosse a lot in my house. We discuss the rules. We get clarifying. We'll actually pull up videos every once in a while. We have a discussion if we have a disagreement about how rules are supposed to be decided in a lacrosse game. So the rules are something that our household talks about. I have 2 children that were trained as officials, 3 children that played lacrosse, and I coached it. So we take these rules very seriously. So I'm watching my daughter officiate a lacrosse game, and I'm watching 2 gentlemen on the sideline who are angry about the decisions that she's making as an official during this lacrosse game. And they say, these officials, talking about my daughter and another woman that were on the field, these officials don't know the rules. They don't have any idea what the rules are of lacrosse. They're saying this because they're disagreeing with the way they're calling the game. No lie. About 30 seconds after this, these same 2 men are discussing something that happened on the field. And they said, what's the rule? One of them looks at the other ones and says, what's the rule about that? And the guy says, I don't know. And then they sit there and discuss for a minute their complete lack of knowledge or understanding about the rules that govern the series of events that just happened on the field. This is a microcosm of the problem that I'm talking about that's going on in the world today, as far as when you just abandon the importance of history and understanding where you came from. Just like these men who are at the same time complaining about officials who do know the rules, who love lacrosse and have given up their time so that they can be there so that people can play lacrosse, people who've actually invested themselves in providing a place for their children to be able to play lacrosse in a structured environment. And they're on the sideline complaining about these people, saying they don't know the rules, they're stupid, they don't have any idea what they're doing, while at the same time admitting in a conversation that neither one of them knows the rules. They don't have the slightest idea what's going on the field. They have never bothered to learn it. The only thing they know is they're not happy with what they're seeing on the field. And this is the way a lot of social criticism works in our country today. People are outraged about the things that they see, angry about the things that other people are saying, hate it when somebody disagrees with them, but they don't have the slightest idea what the world they live in is, how it came to exist, what the past was that brought all of this in, what the structure of the government actually is, what the founding fathers intended, what can actually work, what was the success of socialism, what's been the success of democracy, why do we have the Constitution that we have? These are questions that never occurred to them to ask themselves. All they know is that they're deeply unhappy, and they must be unhappy because someone else is stupid. And that's what Edmund Burke is saying with unleashed progressivism, unleashed liberalism, or unleashed ideas that, or uncontrolled ideas that the past has no value. He says you have no connection to the world that birthed you. All you have is condemnation for it. All you have is the will to destroy it. And you have no idea how to make something better. You see all existing institutions as something, and I'm not saying, by the way, that this is what every person who calls themselves progressive is. I'm just saying that as we understand his warning of what happened in the French Revolution, and by the way, some of the things that we do see in our culture happening today, he's saying the problem is that what got us here had merit. And if we add the necessary changes to what got us here, there's a better chance that those changes will take root and be passed from generation to generation successfully than there is if we just wholesale, whole cloth, decide that everything that came before us was stupid and unworthy of us, and we're starting again. So that will lead to chaos. And I would argue that we see more chaos than is necessary in our world around us today because of exactly the attitude that he was warning against that took root during the French Revolution. So I just thought that was interesting. Edmund Burke, talking about principled conservatism. All right, so let's get into now segment 3 here. I want to talk for a second about German law. A really short conversation about German abortion law. The reason for that is because many years ago, I was interviewing a guy by the name of Richard Stith. He is a philosopher at Valparaiso. We were discussing some of his specialty as far as it talks to pro-life dialogue and the way that we talk about the issue of abortion. And one of the things what he discussed was the idea that his main focus was understanding the difference between developing things and constructed things. That was his great addition. And that's a huge addition, right? Because a lot of times people misunderstand the idea of what the unborn are, and they would say, they're not human yet. They won't be human until these certain attributes or capacities are added to them. This state, they're not human. Add that to them, they become human. And he says, and he was basically the first person to start this. Maureen Kondik has added to this as well, but he says, look, that's how we talk about constructed things, built things. It makes sense to look at a computer and say, when did we add the components necessary to it to make it a computer? It makes sense to say that about a car. It makes sense to say that about a building. At some point, you have to add things to whatever building you're in for it to get a certificate of occupancy from the government that says that it's now suitable for habitability. You can have people inside of it because it's now a habitable building as opposed to a construction zone. So he said, so when we're talking about built or construction things, that sort of discussion is legitimate. But he says human beings are developing things. We're developing in accordance to information that existed from the moment that was there from the moment we came into existence. We are biological entities that are interacting with our environment in accordance with a genetic code that has been there from the moment that we came into existence, that is dictating the outcomes of that interaction between the information and the being that was there and the things that are happening in the environment around us. So it doesn't make sense to ask at what point was something added to make you human, because you're developing in accordance with your human nature, with your humanity, with your human identity in very predictable ways. Human beings are not built like computers or buildings. We come into existence and we develop in accordance with information that's there in our interaction with our environment. You're not going to add capacities to me. I will express capacities that are natural to me as I age and develop. And there's different things. I know Scott Klusendorf likes to use an example of a Polaroid, where he says if you took a picture with a Polaroid, and he talks about this rare big cat that he took a picture of, and he said, and I was waving it, and it's that brown. Somebody comes and rips it in half, and I said, "What did you do? And you just ruined my picture of that jaguar." And I said, "Well, no, I just tore up a picture of a brown smudge." And he said, "Don't you realize the picture was there? It was developing. You just destroyed it before it had a chance to develop." Bill Burr actually gives an example of this when he talks about in something that went viral a while back, where he talks about a cake in an oven, and he says that he's pro-choice, but he says that he he's pretty sure it's murder, right? And that you're destroying a baby. And he said, if I had a cake in the oven and somebody came over and took my cake out and threw it on the floor, I'd say, what did you do to my cake? And he said, it's not a cake, it's just ingredients. And he would say, no, it was a cake. You just need to leave it alone and let it keep cooking. These are affirming that concept of a developing thing versus a constructed thing. It was what it was when you destroyed it. It didn't need to have things added to it to become those things. So that's his area of expertise. Afterward, we're at the end of it, by the way, and we're about to turn it off. And I'm so angry because I lost this interview. I lost it in a digital issue that I had with one of my old computers. And at the end of it, after he and I have talked for about an hour and a half, he said, I'd like to talk for a second about German abortion laws. Because he says, I think at the end of the day, that's where we're going to be the best we can hope for. I said, okay. Because he said, I don't think abortion ought to be completely illegal. I mean, he said, obviously, and ideally, I think it should, because I'm against it. He said, but I don't think it's a realistic governmental hope. He said, but the German laws are interesting. The German laws, which are now being fought by a certain political group, in Germany, abortion in the first 12 weeks is only allowed up within the first 12 weeks, but it's illegal. It's condemned as wrong. But you can still get abortions if you're willing to go through certain steps. Now, in cases of the life of the mother or rape or incest or things like that, you're automatically allowed to get it. If you don't, you have to. So here's the conditions. When a woman's life or physical or mental health is at risk due to pregnancy, when the pregnancy is a result of rape or incest, when a qualified doctor confirms that there is a serious risk of physical or mental harm to the woman if the pregnancy continues, when the woman undergoes mandatory counseling and observes a 3-day waiting period before the procedure. So on its face, abortion is illegal in Germany. Officially, the country of Germany condemns abortion as wrong, but women are still able to get abortions if they follow that list of things. Now, the push right now is to make it legal in the first 12 weeks without all of these necessary steps. There's a group pushing that forward because, and it's always the underprivileged that they point to. They say, well, there's some people that just can't possibly meet the requirements that you're asking them to meet to be able to get their abortions. What are we going to do about these poor people that can't kill their kids? We've got to be able to make it possible for them to be able to destroy their children before they're born. Won't you care about these poor people and their need to get abortions? So that's the smaller communities don't have the medical ability to do this. They shouldn't be forced to do this. They should be allowed to get abortions for the first 12 weeks. So the push now is for the legalization of abortion in the first 12 weeks. Why do I want to bring that? Well, number one, I think it's interesting that Richard Stith says that the German model, as it exists today, which is being fought, is probably the best he thinks legally that we'd be able to get. That you would have an official, which he says is important, official legal condemnation of the practice is wrong, but then avenues supplied for people to get it in a very restricted time frame of 12 weeks. Why is that important? Because it's impossible sometimes to try to help people understand the restricted nature of the practice of abortion in other countries around the world. As we in the United States here, anytime there's any kind of restrictions placed on abortion in the United States, the first response is just absolute insanity and hyperbole about what's happened. How can you restrict access? You're destroying people's lives. You're making this world a worse place. You're killing people and women are dying as a result of this. Any restrictions that are offered in any way is somehow an impingement on their natural right to exist in any way that they wish to exist. And then you can point to other countries and say, look, other countries around the world are restricting abortion practice. Even in the United States, if you did the first 12 weeks, that's still 90% of abortion. About 90% of abortions are happening in the first 12 weeks. So it's not going to be a great limiter in the number of abortions they can get. But Richard Stith was saying to me in a conversation that he and I had on recording that he thought that was probably the best legal middle ground we were ever going to be able to reach with the people who disagree with us on this issue. But I wanted to talk about Germany before I talked about Arizona because, and right now, at France, I think late last year, France enshrined constitutionally abortion as a right for women in the country. And Macron, decided to speak out and say, I'm going to make sure that the entire European Union ultimately has these permissive abortion laws. He's not going to be able to do that, by the way. There's whole countries that restrict the practice of abortion much more than France, and they don't care what Macron thinks about anything. And if he's trying to figure out ways to do financial or economic punishments against those people, good luck. You're going to end up dissolving the European Union over this issue. But it just goes to show the commitment that that side politically has to this issue. So here we go. Germany's laws right now, there's a fight to change that. And the Germans are saying, look, you'll be able to get abortions. We don't understand why we want to change it now. It's working. In the United States, let's transition now to Arizona. The Arizona Supreme Court ruled recently that an 1864 abortion law was constitutional under the framework established in Dobbs versus Jackson. Now, as always, I never heard any person talking about this that acted as if they read the actual decision. I did read it. And page 1, in the first couple of lines, the Supreme Court Justices of Arizona say, we're not saying we support the law. We're not saying we like the law. What we're saying is that under Dobbs versus Jackson, you have no constitutional right to get an abortion. And so a law that restricts the practice of abortion in any particular state is not unconstitutional based on those merits. If you want to address this legislatively, knock yourself out. That's what the Supreme Court said they want. And even they said, we encourage you to do so. Our ruling is limited to this moment to the idea that the law as it exists is not unconstitutional. Now, I want to read the actual language of the relevant section before I discuss anything else. Okay? So, this is in what's called the Howell Code. It was the first legislative assembly for the territory of Arizona. So it wasn't even the state of Arizona when this was established. It was Arizona was a territory. And the Howell Code, if you don't know about the expansion west in the United States as people moved out, before laws got there, these places were genuinely lawless lands. If you have, Deadwood is an incredibly profane, incredibly adult and mature television show, but it does get right the first part before South Dakota becomes a territory, how if you went to Deadwood, there were literally no laws. There was no government. There were people trying to make a profit, and so they established towns or cities, but there were no laws to enforce. And so as the territory of Arizona is trying to progress towards becoming a state, they establish a legislative assembly. And in that legislative assembly, they pass the Howell Code, where they address laws governing the territory of Arizona in a place where there were no laws. And so these laws in the Howell Code represent the moral environment of the people establishing the territory of Arizona in 1864. So I want to read the actual section, which is fairly short, section 45. Every person who shall willfully and maliciously administer or cause to be administered to or taken by any person any poison or other noxious or destructive substances or liquid with the intention to cause the death of such person, and being thereof duly convicted, shall be punished by imprisonment in the territorial prison for a term not less than 10 years, and which may extend to life. So if you poison somebody, you get 10 years to life. And every person who shall administer or cause to be administered or taken any medicinal substance, or shall use or cause to be used any instruments whatsoever, with the intention to procure the miscarriage of any woman, then being with child, and shall be thereof duly convicted, shall be punished by imprisonment in the territorial prison for a term of not less than 2 years, nor more than 5 years, provided that no physician shall be affected by the last clause of this section, who in the discharge of his professional duties deems it necessary to produce the miscarriage of any woman in order to save her life. So, that second half of that is what all of this is about. If you perform an abortion, procure an abortion for someone, and you kill the child, and you are convicted, you will go to prison for no less than 2 years, not more than 5. By the way, in the Howell Code, you just heard the punishment for poisoning somebody was 10 years to life. The punishment for murder, if you're convicted of murder, is death. Just you're dead. So in the Howell Code, they say, if you perform an abortion, procure an abortion, if you kill an unborn child, basically, for any other reason than to save the life of the mother, then, and you are convicted, 2 to 5 years. Okay, that's it. That is the what we're about to start talking about. That is the Arizona law. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying that it's reasonable or something that I think should be passed. I'm not making any judgment on it whatsoever for the purpose of this conversation. I know people that think 2 to 5 years wouldn't be enough. I know people that think that probably sounds about right. And I know a lot of people that would be outraged about the idea of punishing women and doctors like that for getting abortion. We have had in the past Leah Savas come on the show and talk about the history of abortion and the book that she wrote with Marvin Olasky, where we have discussed at length the problem they had in prosecuting even abortionists that they knew were performing abortions. And so the idea that any women probably ever served jail time for this is likely zero, because prosecuting even the abortionists was terribly difficult. Prosecuting abortionists, even in an environment, a moral environment where everyone hated abortion and thought that it ought to be illegal, was a terribly difficult thing to do. I have whole books written about this. But I do know people on all sides on this issue that would speak very passionately about it. The point is, it's just making the case that we think abortion is wrong, and if you kill a life through the practice of abortion, you will be punished. You may not like it, but this doesn't sound like something that is some holdover from some earlier time. So here's what I want to get into now. I want to take a moment to look at some of the reactions that came as a result of this. Now, I have some video we're going to show with John Oliver, but as we get into John Oliver and talk about some of the things, I want to talk about first the Arizona thing. Let's see about this clip right here.
All of this wrong! Well, I would love to talk about South Korean election graphics all night. Sadly, we have to turn to Arizona, because this week it did this.
The Arizona Supreme Court ruled today that a near total abortion ban on the books in Arizona since the Civil War is enforceable. Under the long dormant 1864 law, abortion is a felony. Performing or assisting a woman with having one is punishable by imprisonment.
Now, all of that is horrifying, including the fact that any kind of medical procedure is being dictated by a law from the 1800s. An era when doctors prescribed, and this is true, chloroform for asthma, cocaine for hay fever, and tobacco smoke enemas for cholera. And by the way, no thank you, I'll just go ahead and die from the cholera if it's all the same to you. The point is, it was clearly a very different era back then, as a CNN anchor tried unnecessarily to explain to one of his guests.
You're a Republican strategist. Do you really want states going back to Civil War era?
Okay, before we get to that, and I want to play that again in a second here, because since we don't have the video up for this particular section, turn the computer on. No, the mic. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to that, I did not have the mic. So thank you, JD. Before we get to that next section, I want to cover. He gives you ridiculous abortion laws. Ridiculous laws that existed, or medical treatments, I'm sorry. He gives you ridiculous medical treatments that existed during the time that this law was passed. But this isn't a medical issue in the sense of what the law that exists is saying. The law is saying that the unborn are human. By the way, the people that were responsible for the early pro-life movement in the United States were Civil War doctors. They were medical professionals who saw in their own, if you go read their testimonies, they saw enough death. They didn't want to preside over more of it. And so they became the people who argued for the value of unborn life initially at this, what I would call the first great pushback against abortion in the United States. Marvin Olasky's book, Abortion Rights, goes into this, and Leah Savas and Marvin Olasky's book, The Story of Abortion in America, both of those books go into this. Joseph Delapina's book, Dispelling the Myths of Abortion History, it goes into all of this. All of those are resources that you can use to read about this time. But as medical science progresses, the ability to perform abortions without killing the woman becomes a reality. So the idea of the demands on doctors now to involve themselves in killing the unborn, the doctors reject it. Initially, they say, look, I've seen enough death. I don't want to be involved in this. And this is a heinous crime. We shouldn't be killing children before they're born. And it's in that time, through the consultation with doctors, that these early abortion laws become what they are. The moral condemnation of abortion isn't because the medical practitioners were stupid. They understood exactly what they were being asked to do through the process of abortion. And by the way, there were crazy treatments for different things, but that's because this is the time where the medical practice and scientific practice of medicine is just starting to be born, and you're getting away from older, more folk practices of medicine. And so there's all sorts of crazy things going on in the medical field back then, but that does not mean that these are the same doctors that we see who are operating in this venue, who are pushing for pro-life laws. This was the beginning of medical science at this point. You see a transition from old medicine to new medicine that starts here and sort of culminates in the Spanish influenza outbreak in 1818. We have the first time of medical science being at the forefront of dealing with what happened during that pandemic. So all of that is beginning here. So to point out that there were weird medical practices at that time isn't particularly helpful, because it doesn't address the idea if the doctors that were behind these kind of laws had those same medical practices or thought those same things. It's very possible that they didn't, because there were entirely different types of practice of medicine going on and overlapping at this time as we moved from folk medicine into medical science. So this sort of humor is funny, and I agree. I think it's funny. And I've told you, I think John Oliver's a funny guy. But what it doesn't do is help us to understand what's wrong with the law, outside of the fact that it's outrageous in the minds of people who support abortion law that you would punish women or doctors for the practice of abortion. But before we get to this thing, because the next thing is just kind of funny and ought to be included. Before we get to that, I want to point out, too, that for years through Cyril Means' history that we were offered in Roe v. Wade, we were assured that all laws that restricted abortion back in the old days were put in place not because they cared about the unborn, but because they wanted to protect women. And this is clearly not the case in this particular case, that these people see abortion as a crime because of the destruction of an early human life, and they think it ought to be punished if the person is convicted of committing that crime. We see evidence of just what we see here is a moral environment where the people in the Arizona Territory, as they were starting it, wanted to make sure as they began this territory, and remember the reflections that were going on during this time as they were opening new territories from back in the early 1800s all the way through now. They were requiring to be very clear about what they thought about human life, because not just because of issues like this, but also because of slavery. And as they came into existence, many of these territories and upcoming states wanted to make sure that they were not going to be a part of the slave nation that existed in the southern United States, where I live here. Now, here's interesting. When you hear this next audio part, all that's important for you to understand is that Jim Acosta from CNN is talking to a Republican strategist who is a black man about the outrage of what women not being allowed to vote at the time that this law was passed. I just wanted to play this part because I do think it's funny.
As a CNN anchor tried unnecessarily to explain to one of his guests.
You're a Republican strategist. Do you really want states going back to Civil War era laws on reproductive freedom? I mean, women didn't even have the right to vote at that point. This sounds like kryptonite. This sounds toxic for Republicans across the country.
I mean, Jim, I don't want states going back to pre-Civil War.
Well, that's
for obvious reasons here, right?
Point taken.
Yeah, I hope the point is taken. I love the cluelessness of looking at a black man and saying that the 1860s were bad because women didn't have the right to vote. I mean, it's true, but also maybe not the worst thing people didn't have the right to do back then.
Okay, that's funny. All right, so for me, the outrage of the Arizona law, as I was looking and understanding, I don't think John Oliver gets anywhere. And so I actually go to another episode of John Oliver dealing with abortion for most of what I want to talk about today, because he talks about the change in the culture in the United States and the way that the laws are impacting everybody. I think that the outrage of the Arizona, and by the way, to this point, the Republicans have not backed down on this. The Republicans in Arizona have not. There are initially a few that stepped out, and like Kari Lake and people like that said, I don't support this law. But the Republican Assembly has yet to fully back down on this issue, and they've let it stay there for a while. Kudos to them for not backing down because of the panic and misrepresentation that's being put about this. The important thing is, though, to two reactions that we have to manage, because the hysteria over this is that simply by virtue of this law existing in 1864, it is unreasonable and crazy. But what I read to you is not unreasonable and crazy. It may not be legislation or law that you agree with, but it's not unreasonable or crazy to make it illegal to perform abortions and to punish people that do that. I don't think it's wise right now in the political environment. I don't think you'll ever be able to get it. I don't think we've ever been good at prosecuting people over the issue of abortion, even when the whole country morally agreed with us on this issue. And I think certainly right now, where it has swung a different way and the public opinion is against us and we're losing from state to state in different places every time this comes up on referendum, I think this is a bad time to push that sort of legislation. But I don't think that the Arizona Supreme Court looking at that and saying under Dobbs versus Jackson, that's constitutional, is wild and crazy. And I don't think the law in and of itself is wildly unreasonable and somehow anachronistic in some way that couldn't be understood through a modern lens, when we know that there are people today who think that if you operate in the practice of abortion, that you ought to be punished for doing that. And the punishment itself is different and less severe than all of the other comparable crimes of destroying life, including murder, which carries with it death in the Howell Code. And as we just saw prior to that in the same section, addressing the idea of poisoning somebody for the purpose of hurting them and killing them, which carries 10 years to life in prison. They have assigned this as a particular kind of violation, a particular kind of homicide, and they have dealt with it differently than the others with a less severe punishment. I don't think it's wildly, even if I disagree with it, I don't think it's wildly anachronistic and some holdover from some bizarre time. And I think his mentioning of weird medical practices either demonstrates that he just doesn't care or doesn't understand what the overlap that was going on at the time between medical science and folk medicine. But let's move on then from Arizona. And let's just get into addressing the way that John Oliver talks about abortion as a whole, because I think he represents the most clever as far as his side, as how he talks about it. I think that his message resonates with people, obviously, because I was given this link multiple times by people who want to be able to say, look at how John Oliver pointed this out. John Oliver said this, you should look at him. He's given a serious platform, considered a serious thinker. Now, I want to preface this all by saying there are two rules that I give everybody that I talk to about how they gain information in the world around them. The first rule is, do not take your history from movies. I have never seen a movie claiming to be historical that was even close to being historical. And I'm not even just talking about anything. Even things, for example, when The Founder came out about Ray Kroc, I remember the day that it came out, it was during this time where, for whatever reason, it is very, very popular for people to hate McDonald's. I don't get it. But I really don't. I don't understand it. I don't understand why people hate McDonald's. I know it's an internet thing. I know people believe the stupidest things ever about McDonald's. Like there was that one time there was a video running around of some pink goo and everybody was saying that's what chicken nuggets were made of. McDonald's made a video of them actually producing their chicken nuggets and released it on YouTube so that you can see the factory where they make the chicken nuggets and how they're made. And I showed that to people would say, "Did you see that pink goo? That's McDonald's. That's what you're eating when you eat chicken nuggets." Well, first of all, if that's what I'm eating when I'm eating chicken nuggets, all you've done is tell me that I love pink goo. You really haven't done much against me. It's not that big a deal to me. But the problem is now right lie. And McDonald's already released a video showing you how they make their chicken nuggets. And whether you like them or not is irrelevant. That's just not how they're made. And so there's all these lies about how they did stuff and all these lies. And so it was very popular, I guess, to believe the worst about Ray Kroc. Not that I think Ray Kroc is a perfect guy. I don't know a whole lot about the guy, to be honest with you. But when the movie came out, Michael Keaton performed him. Of course, it was popular to hate McDonald's at the time and still is. And so they're ripping on him. And I'm driving and I'm listening to NPR, going back to the beginning of this show. I'm listening to NPR and it's, what's that? That dovetailed nicely, didn't it? We just bring it all back up. Chekhov's gun. It was mentioned at the beginning. It's coming back now. We're in full accordance with Chekhov's rifle. All right. So here we go. I'm listening to NPR, not a bastion of conservatism. They have an author who's an expert, the leading authority on Ray Kroc and his life. He's written 2 books, one about Ray Kroc and one about Ray Kroc's wife and her charitable efforts. They ask him, is this movie accurate? And he goes off for about 10 straight minutes about everything that's wrong with the movie and about all the things that it gets wrong, all the factual mistakes that it gets wrong. And he even says, I'm not even the biggest Ray Kroc fan, man. I'm his biographer, but I don't think he's the greatest guy in the world. But everything that you're seeing as far as how they relate what happened in this movie is factually inaccurate. I just want to add this part. A guy that I know who works in ministry, still works in ministry, but he doesn't like me anymore. We're not really friends anymore. He doesn't like me because of things like about what we're about to say. He posted I just saw Founder. Somebody asked him in the comment threads, is that historically accurate? His response, it's incredibly accurate. Based on what, dude? So I sent him a message. Dude, I just heard the leading authority on Ray Kroc go off for 10 or 20 minutes on NPR about how factually inaccurate this movie is. It's not accurate. Why is you as a minister of our Lord Jesus Christ, who's responsible for bringing the truth to the world, out there saying things that you don't know anything about? Is it accurate? It's incredibly accurate. You don't have the slightest idea whether this is accurate or not. So that's why he doesn't talk to me. There's things like that. And this wasn't the only time this sort of thing happened. I wish it was, but he did this a few times and I would send him messages saying, you cannot be so reckless as to say something happened or something is true that didn't happen or is not true without taking any personal responsibility to check on it. So don't get your history from movies. The other one is don't get your news from comedians. They're funny. I'll admit it. I think Jon Stewart and John Oliver are 2 funny guys. I mean, some of the other ones I don't care for, but I think they're both funny. I enjoy watching them, but they're comedians. And anytime they tell you something factually inaccurate, if you point out that it's factually inaccurate, you get the same response. Well, I'm a comedian. It's a joke. You weren't supposed to take it seriously, but your audience does. And you expect us to take it seriously. So it's a game. It's just a game. It's a political game. The other side is better at this than our side. Far, far better at it. That's why we're going to lose all the time. They have the music. They have the movies. They have the comedians. They have the television shows. They have everybody on their side. And so they're just going to pump out this sort of message all of the time. But let's go back to dealing with John. So go into this. I think John Oliver's funny. I think Jon Stewart's funny. 2 rules. Don't get your history from movies. Don't get your news from comedians. If you take nothing from this podcast today, take those 2 things. Don't take your history from movies. They're always wrong. Don't take your news from comedians. They make no effort to be truly responsible for the things that they're saying. They just are pushing their own political viewpoint, which is fine. That's their platform that they earned, that they get to do by being entertaining. And they're doing it for the effect of being funny, not for being informative. Okay, so let's get to John Oliver talking about abortion then, because I went to one of his other shows, a show where he focused as his main issue on abortion and the change that abortion had made around the new abortion laws had made all over the country. And I want to deal with some of the things that he said. Now, he focuses a lot, by the way, on Texas as he goes through this. And so On this one, let's start off. Let's do the first one. We're going to look at some of the video, some of the claims that he made in the context of how abortion laws are changing the world around us and address them as they come up. So let's do the first video that we have queued up. And now we actually have
question. Because for the record, abortion bans are objectively not safe for women and can needlessly put them through absolute hell. Take what happened to this woman in Texas, whose ultrasound not only revealed no chance of survival for the fetus, but also potentially life-threatening complications for her.
Kaylee's doctor was clear.
When he's born, he's going to suffocate to death. He may live for a few minutes, he may live for an hour, but he is going to die.
Her doctors said they could not perform an abortion, noting in her records termination is not legal in the state of Texas.
How could you be so cruel as to pass a law that you know will hurt women and that you know will cause babies to be born in pain? He was going to die a painful death. So how is that humane? How is that saving anybody?
They desperately want to have another baby, but there's a high likelihood that something will go wrong again.
The last time that I saw my OB, she said, do not get pregnant in Texas right now.
Wow. That is not only devastating, it is a truly horrible thing to have to add to the list of things that pregnant women are not safe to do. So it's now officially ride a roller coaster, eat sushi, dye your roots, and simply exist in the state of Texas.
All right, let's stop. So let's address this first one, okay? First of all, and these are all, by the way, I think it's fair that people bring up hard cases. I really do. I think that the things that we're going to be talking about for the next few minutes are some of the hardest things that we have to deal with as pro-lifers, and I don't think that we have a satisfying answer. We have moral duties and obligations. We have responsibilities to behave in a certain way towards other human beings, but I don't think we ever have an answer that will satisfy our critics on these things. Now, facing tough questions requires us to put them into context. Okay? So, for example, what this woman went through, Cade Despain is the husband, Kaylee Despain is his wife. If you read further about them and find out more information about them other than the clip that was shared here, they grew up in Texas. They at one time were passionately anti-abortion, and then they had several miscarriages. And that process, having severe complications, they're hospitalized, they had blood clots, 3 miscarriages in the early years of their marriage. That process changed their way that they thought about the issue of abortion, and they became more permissive in their view of abortion. So they got pregnant again. So after 3 terrible miscarriages, they get pregnant again. Everything looks like it's moving along fine. And then they learn that their child that they named Finley had heart, lung, brain, kidney, and genetic defects, would either be stillborn or die within minutes of birth. Carrying him to term put Kaylee at high risk for severe pregnancy complications, including blood clots, preeclampsia, and cancer. And even so, they have a doctor that tells them that they can't get an abortion in Texas. She says, I've never felt more betrayed by a place I was once so proud to be from through the years. Now, one of the things I would like to address here is something that's going to come up here later on, that Texas has these confusing laws. Well, we'll table that for a second. We'll discuss that later, the idea of the confusing laws, because there's certain things to work through here. Number one, there is no way that what was happening to this woman and her husband was ever going to be anything other than terrible. There is no way, when natural evil has occurred, in that sense we talk about it, this is not the way human life is supposed to develop. Something horrible has happened. Now our job is to figure out what's the best thing that we can do morally with the bad situation that we've been given. So the doctor's objection was to say that although your diagnosis is tragic, your child isn't dead yet. So you're asking permission to kill your child. However certain you are of that diagnosis, that's outside the laws of the state of Texas. Now, her defense was, It's inhumane to ask that child to be born and then suffer suffocation early in its life. But there is going to be no painless way to destroy that child. It will be the means of destroying that child earlier, before it's born, are going to be horrible and brutal as well. It will experience the death one way or another. At this point, the tragedy of the death of the child, as it's been diagnosed, appears to be unavoidable. Now, there are other health reasons that she wants to, but if it's just in this idea that it's immoral to require the child to suffer, we don't know what the suffering of the child is at birth versus the suffering of the child is through the dismemberment of abortion or through the malnutrition that it would go through if they did a medical abortion. However they're going to do that, we're not good at understanding what that suffering is going to be. And however much pain that she's in, and obviously any human being who loves their child or can even empathize with somebody who loves their child understands what it's like to want what's best for their child, even to prevent their child from further suffering. But it's not clear to us at this point that the suffering is going to be avoided one way or another. And so the doctors appeal to this idea that this is a terrible diagnosis, but I can't kill your child, isn't wildly inhumane. It's just the point of view that they're struggling with right now. Now, we're going to get to the law in a second here to see whether or not that doctor was even operating in conjunction with this. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up is that although this situation is 100% of this woman's experience, and so I don't want to minimize the importance of our empathy on what she's going through as we process through things like this. And as we think about things as a society, like what could our answer be to someone like this in this situation? Can we be creatively merciful? Are there opportunities available to us to love this woman and her family in this time in a way that's not life-destructive by its very nature? And we need to be actively thinking about those things. And I know we are. There are people out there that do hospice care for women that are going through certain situations like this, who are choosing to carry to term, to spend that first and few moments that life has in a loving environment, so that the only thing that they may know in the time they live, and I actually heard that line recently in the television show Yellowstone, where there's a parent dealing with the grief of a child that died very early, born. She held her, the child died, and another character tells her, your child lived a perfect life. The only thing that they knew while they were alive was that their mother loved them. That was their whole experience of their short life, the love of their mother. And we should fight for those kind of narratives and not feel sheepish about saying what we know we have to say, which is that those of us who see all life as the image bearers of God are trying to find creative ways to love everyone and to treat every neighbor as ourselves, and to create a situation where we can be creatively merciful and loving to somebody going through this terrible thing that they're going through. So it's 100% of this woman's experience, and she deserves our empathy, and situations like this deserve our focus on how to do it as best we can. This doesn't explain why every woman everywhere ought to be free to get an abortion for any reason or no reason. This is an extreme example. And the insane leap that he makes for the sake of his joke at the end of that segment, where he says that getting pregnant in Texas, being pregnant in Texas, is something that's dangerous for women. Because this woman who has had a history of terrible tragedy in her attempts to have her child, and the doctor's advice was specific to her because of her history, because of the challenges that any pregnancy that she has will bring to it. Her doctor said, I would advise you not to get pregnant in Texas. her doctor's advice to her, which for the sake of a joke, John Oliver opens up to a broad statement that all pregnant women in Texas are at risk. When the percentages that we're talking about, and I've got a list of different organizations with different percentages, at the high end, we're talking about 8% of at the very highest estimation I've seen, 8% of pregnancies end because through the practice of termination because of some health risk to either the mother or to the child. 8%. That's the highest I've seen. The average is somewhere like 2 to 3% that I see argued that are published. So that's both risk of health to the mother and to the child. We're talking about far less than 90% in all likelihood. I mean, far less than 10%. More than 90% have nothing to do with this. Have nothing to do with this situation. And so for him to take a medical advice that was given to one woman with a past of pregnancy trouble and then extend that out for the sake of his joke to just existing in Texas as a pregnant woman puts you in danger. It's just, I wouldn't say it's beneath him, but I don't know. But I don't know this guy. It's not like we're friends or anything. It's despicable. Why is it despicable? Because it's trading in fear. Do you really want to make everyone pregnant in Texas who has a healthy pregnancy, who has no history of these issues, who is developing just fine, dread their pregnancy by making up an issue and blowing something up to be worse than it actually is? Now let's get to the next one. Okay. Before we get to your next video, I think there's something else I want to play. Yeah, okay. So let's go back, because I'm oftentimes very critical of doctors on this show. Hopefully we'll get this to play without an ad. If it has an ad, I'm sorry, it's because I paused too long on YouTube. But I'm often critical of doctors because I say the problem isn't the laws. The problem is that cowardly doctors who don't know how to practice and who are more interested in making political statements by denying being able to do things for women than they are to actually performing their duty to their patients. And that's going to come up a lot as we get more into the bad doctor. But I want to talk about this for a second. Here's from a different portion of the episode.
Something else was clearly being communicated. And while you might think that doctors facing emergency situations should simply take it upon themselves to quietly perform abortions anyway, as this OBGYN points out, it's just not that simple.
Some people say, well, doctors should just do it. You should just go take that patient to the OR and do that abortion. I don't know of any doctor who does an abortion just by themselves. It requires an anesthesia team, a nursing team, supervising team to get you into the OR. So in order for somebody to agree with me as I want to take that patient to the OR, there's lots of other people who are going to weigh into and be scared and say, no, we have to wait for legal to sign off. And that's when people die.
Holy
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's when people die. That's her statement. Waiting for legal to sign off, that's when people die. So, rather than just get outraged and cuss like John Oliver does, I decided to try to figure out, is this a statement of fact? Is that when people are dying? Have people been dying that I'm unaware of because of this law in the United States? Or is this just a hypothetical from somebody who hasn't actually been through this? An OBGYN who is defending herself against criticism from people like me who say the problem is not the laws necessarily. The problem is you're bad doctors. So I looked it up. I tried to find all of the cases that these different, and I looked at CNN and I looked elsewhere, and because a lot of this stuff was being written by people from CNN and New York Times, I wanted to find if there was a place, if this doctor was talking about when people are dying or a hypothetical case where somebody might die. Now, here's an interesting thing. There's a couple of different things I want to talk about. CNN links 3. One of them we've already talked about, which is the first case we've already discussed. And then one other, by the way, this is when we're talking about bad doctors. Let's go ahead and talk about this horrible doctor because it goes to part of one of my point here all the time that these are just terrible people. And they, in some states, doctors weigh ruinous litigation against proper care for women who have miscarriages. This is a CNN article. So a woman, Marlene Estelle, had a miscarriage, and she begged her doctor to help, but instead was forced to walk around for at least 2 weeks with the fetal remains inside her because of strict anti-abortion laws. What a load of nonsense. Her doctor, who was the person who told her that her child had died and was no longer alive through ultrasound technology, refuses to remove the dead child from within her and forces her to go get another ultrasound to demonstrate the death of and another ultrasound verifies what was diagnosed. The child is no longer alive, and the doctor still will not perform it. Essentially, we're told because they're afraid of abortion laws. That's bad doctor. Bad doctor. Bad doctor. If you're so cowardly that you won't look after the health of the person in front of you, if you're so worried about and that comes up a lot, by the way, when you read about these doctors who talk about these terrible abortion laws and they're afraid to do anything because what happens if I get caught? They're worried about their inability to make money. They are more committed to their future position as a doctor than they are to the health of the patients in front of them. Again, bad doctor. Not bad law. The law had nothing at all to do with that woman, but that was one of the examples that were given about the terrible repercussions of abortion laws. Okay, but so it's like, who died in Texas? Who died, since we're talking about Texas? I wasn't able to find an article in the New Yorker about a woman who died. The article is, did an abortion ban cost a young Texas woman her life? As many conservatives hail the fall of Roe for saving unborn lives, high-risk pregnancies become even more perilous. This is a terrible story, by the way, about a young woman named Jennifer Alvarez Estrada Glick. 27 years old, I think she was. She didn't want an abortion. She wasn't asking for an abortion. The abortion laws weren't keeping her from getting an abortion that she wanted to protect herself. She was medically described as morbidly obese, had pre-existing heart conditions, and was a type 2 diabetic. High-risk pregnancy. And even worse, she was a high-risk pregnancy in a low-income area with terrible medical services. Her story is tragic and I think I think people should read the article. I think it's a very good article in the sense of it raises questions about the ability for low-income people to access proper medical care and the limits that they have versus the wealthy, which is something that we hear about a lot on this particular issue. It's not fair because the wealthy people have better access to it. That's true of everything, by the way. Everything, everywhere, all the time. The wealthy people have better access to everything. They have better access to natural wonders and to be able to tour the world. They have better access to healthier food. They have better access to medical services. They have better access to everything because they're wealthy. And if you read this, and I have argued, by the way, in front of audiences that I think there are perfectly reasonable places for wealthy people to have better access to things. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that when it comes to how we treat people medically and the way that we make things available for people as far as cures or therapies, I think that we should strive as a culture for that not to be a barrier. That I don't think being poor ought to be a reason that you should, let's use recent advances in CRISPR technology to treat things like sickle cell anemia. I don't think that because you're poor that you should be forced to endure sickle cell when we can cure other people who are willing to pay. I think that we should find some way, the resources, some way, be creative. That doesn't mean I agree with particular views on universal health care, things like that. That's different. I evaluate every political move or every bill or every legislation on its merits, not on what I hope the effect will be. What I'm saying is that I do believe that medical needs ought to be met for everybody as best that we can, and that there ought not to be people like this young woman who can't get the proper medical. Now, here's a problem, though. Even with the substandard medical care that she was receiving, she didn't take care of herself. They talk about, even in the article, she's not taking the medicine that she should take. She's not taking care of herself. She's not doing the things necessary to look after her own health, which is another problem that we have oftentimes with low-income demographics or low-income areas, is that they don't take care of themselves either. But that's a whole nother issue. That has nothing to do with abortion laws in Texas. And the very question of that frames this article, did an abortion ban cost a young Texas woman her life? Here's why they asked the question. Because as it becomes very clear early on, some medical doctors say she never should have gotten pregnant in the first place. She wasn't just high risk. She was certainly going to end up having health issues, and the baby was either going to die or kill her. One of those two things was going to happen, because she was morbidly obese, because she had pre-existing heart conditions that almost killed her. She'd had strokes. And we're talking about someone who, at the end of the day, was a type 2 diabetic that wasn't taking care of herself. She wasn't taking her blood pressure medication like she should. She wasn't losing the weight like she should have lost. She wasn't doing any of those things. But the important thing is she never wanted an abortion. There is some indication that she did tell one of her friends, who admits in the article, that if she had to choose between herself and her child, she would choose her child. Why then do they ask the question, did an abortion ban cost a young Texas woman her life? Why is this whole article written in such a prestigious magazine as like the New Yorker? Because they say doctors should have been telling her from the beginning that she ought to get an abortion. That should have been said to her from the moment she became pregnant. Not because she wanted one and the state laws wouldn't let her, but because they couldn't find anyone that had told her, you should get an abortion. You should abort this child. Several doctors weighed in after the fact, after having looked over and said, I would have told her from the very beginning that abortion was the path that she should take. So no abortion laws. So they say, why didn't somebody tell her that she should get an abortion? Well, they were afraid of being sued in the state of Georgia or in the state of Texas for encouraging her to get an abortion. I didn't see any indication of that. What they had was that a bunch of overworked doctors were dealing with somebody who didn't want an abortion, and that they were trying their best to treat the medical issues that they had in front of them. So their fear of lawsuit set aside, if an abortion was what was going to save her life, they're saying, well, we couldn't do that because we were afraid of the law. This was not a case, though, of somebody that was looking for an abortion that couldn't get it. It was a case of somebody who didn't have doctors telling her that she ought to get an abortion, and they blame, again, the abortion laws for this failure to communicate that option to that woman, who they say, many of them say, well, she may have been alive had they not done that. May have been alive had they done what they were supposed to do. So I couldn't find any other place where women were dying as a result of this. So I'm left to believe that this woman's conjecture about that is nothing more than our hypothetical. Okay, so, and that's a problem for me. Because what was John, I mean, we heard, as much as I wish I didn't realize he said that, his response was, oh my gosh, that's when people die. Holy, that's when people die. Can you believe this? Well, maybe don't believe it. How about look it up? How about do a Google search? That's what I call a minimal interest in the truth. You're minimally interested in finding out whether something's true if you just do a Google search and check the first few links, right? See if there's some epidemic of women dying at this point. If there is, that's something we're going to have to deal with. But this woman acted like it was a certainty. And as far as I can tell, it hadn't happened, even in the place where they're talking about being the worst place in the world. Okay, so let's get to the next one. The next video, please.
Do not make exceptions considering the health of the mother. But even in states that do have those exceptions, they're often written so vaguely or narrowly that doctors can be unsure how to apply them. Take Texas again, where the health exceptions only apply for a few highly specific conditions. So for everyone else, doctors are now waiting until a patient is at actual risk of imminent death to intervene. Listen to this woman describe what she went through after a fatal fetal condition was diagnosed during her pregnancy.
I had to wait until one of three things happened. Either her heart stopped beating, I went into labor naturally, or I became so sick that my life was in danger. And at that point, because of the laws, the doctors would be able to induce me and we could begin the delivery process. I was first diagnosed on Tuesday, and it took until Friday for one of those three things to occur. And for me, what happened was I got really, really sick really, really fast. Obviously, we live in the middle of Texas, which is a giant state. So to get out of Texas and to get to a neighboring state where we could have gotten healthcare, we would have either had to drive at least 8 hours or fly somewhere.
Okay. Just so we are all perfectly clear, when we say that these laws take away people's right to control their own body, this is what we're talking about. She had to wait from Tuesday to Friday to get close enough to dying to be saved. Preemptively choosing to save her own life was illegal in her state, a state that, remember, this man says is safe for for women.
The problem is that's not true. Not her story. Her story's true. What he just said is not true. He starts it off by saying, laws that are written so vaguely. Now, here's another thing I love about his little piece here, right? He's like, all these state laws are written so vaguely. But where does he keep going back to? Let's keep going back to Texas. Let's just talk about Texas. Okay, let's talk about Texas and the vaguely written laws. Texas law says, if a woman has a life-threatening physical condition aggravated, caused by, or arising from a pregnancy that places the female at risk of death or poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function, that is justification for abortion under Texas law. I want to read that again. Life-threatening physical condition aggravated, caused by, or arising from a pregnancy that places the female at a risk of death or poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function. In the case of this woman, again, her story is tragic. It is the story of a family that wanted to get pregnant and could not. They had had issues with fertility prior to this pregnancy, and this one was progressing, and they were happy. And this is a horrifying thing for someone to go through. And in this particular case, it was at 18 weeks that her water broke, and she was told by the doctors, her doctors, this child will not survive. And having the water broken, it will progress towards illness for the woman if she doesn't naturally miscarry. So that's what the doctor told her. Now, given that there is no chance that the child is going to be alive based on the doctor's diagnosis, and the Texas law is written in such a way that places the female at risk of death or poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function, which the progression of this series of events is going to do, then the legal justification is there for this doctor to act in these circumstances. So why does the doctor not act? Because they're more worried about protecting their career than they are about serving their patients. As a matter of fact, several Texas legislators, when they're asked about this, a lot of them dodged the question, but one of them did answer and say, that's the exact reason that we have those provisions in there. If it's unclear, then we will clarify it even more for the doctors. Someone like this should not have gone through this, but it's not because the law was so vague or because it was only dealing with very specific instances. It was because the doctor was a coward and wouldn't do their job. Again, at least share what you're saying is so vague. The language is there. If there was a risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function, then they were allowed under the law to act. This woman shouldn't have had to go through what she went through. In a perfect world, nobody would have to go through these sorts of things. It's horrifying. It's terrible. But stop acting like it's because of pro-lifers that the doctors won't do their job. If the doctor cared more about the woman in front of her and what she was going through than they did about their fear of what was going to happen to their practice because they think that the language is too vague, if they didn't check or understand what their limits were of what they could do before that instance came up, if they hadn't made their due diligence, had not done their due diligence and made sure that they knew the legal restrictions on their practice of what they were able to do, instead of hiding cowardly behind a law because they were afraid it was going to affect their life, or they were going to be sued, or they were going to lose their license, and they wouldn't be able to practice in that state, if they had just helped the person in front of them within the boundaries of the law as it was written, according to everybody that I have read or listened to on this particular that spoke about it, then that is exactly acting within accordance of the laws of that state. It doesn't matter what I think on this particular case. What matters is the law gave room for action to be taken, and the doctor didn't take it. And if we've already said that one woman said, well, this is how lives get lost because we're waiting for legal approval. Legal approval to do what? To do your job? We already talked a second ago about a woman who was carrying a dead child inside of her, and still the doctor wouldn't do their job. So I'm outraged too. Absolutely outraged at doctors who are more worried about them paying the repercussions of taking care of the person in front of them instead of medically doing their job and having the courage to serve the patient in front of them. In this particular case, the doctor's diagnosis was this child cannot live. At 18 weeks, this is over. But then I agree. And the story gets, here's what happened to the woman, by the way, to complete the story for you. Tuesday, she's sent home and told to wait it out. Friday, she gets suddenly sick while she and her husband are out. And he gets her to the doctor, and she ends up going into ICU because of the and bacterial infection that has grown inside of her because of what's happened. But she survives. And it's a terrible story. It ought never to have happened the way that it happened. And I don't have all the answers. But I certainly don't get outraged and say it's because of the Texas law, because the Texas law is written so vaguely. When the Texas law doesn't just say life of the mother, it says poses a serious risk of substantial impairment of a major bodily function. I think that doctor had sufficient reason to believe that this was going to, because he said, wait till it gets worse. She even says that on there. We'll wait till it gets worse. We'll wait till we know the certainty of what's going to happen, which is that something terrible is going to happen to you. And when that happens, then when we act. Now, they at least could have placed her under medical care at that point, right? If they're going to make her wait, put her in managed medical care so they can keep track of what's happening to her. Don't just send her off by herself to let it happen, because that's where it gets cowardly. Just go somewhere else. Don't be here. I don't want to have to deal with it. That's not managed care. That's not health care. That's cowardice. And don't blame the law. Don't blame the law. Look at the law, the way it's written. It gives you room to move here. A Texas legislator who read it, who was contacted, the one who had the courage to respond, said, yeah, no. We made provisions in the law for that sort of thing. We may need to clarify it. But that's a point he made that I think is well taken. As these sorts of tragedies happen, anytime you are shifting from one paradigm to another, one legal paradigm to another, there's going to be periods of uncertainty. Let's say I'm just way out of line in how ugly I am about the doctors who hide behind all of this so they don't have to risk anything. Let's say that they're all operating in... I'm trying to say it. I mean, they can't all be operating in good faith. The person that won't remove an already dead child from that woman is not in any way operating in good faith. But let's say I say that. I am wrong. I am wrong about all of this. They're operating in the best faith they possibly can in their relationship with their patients in accordance with the laws because they just don't understand them and find the whole environment fear-inducing for whatever reason, right? The Texas legislator's position is well taken. We're in a paradigm shifting position in some of these states where we've had these incredibly permissive laws and that now we're allowed to restrict them. And as we write restrictive laws, we need to be mindful of how the doctors and lawyers and everybody else is going to read those and then make sure that we have clarity in our language. This has happened multiple times, by the way. already when there were laws that were written that had to do with things like ectopic pregnancy or tubal ectopic pregnancy. And there were things that were going, and people were confused about it. And the legislature stepped up and said, no. That's not what we meant. And if you read it that way, then we'll take the onus, we'll take the responsibility of saying that we wrote it poorly, and we're going to write it more clearly so that you can see what we actually meant. This is just a horrible period where we're going to have to go through that. But these things exist on the edges anyway. My point goes back to what this woman and what this family went through is terrible. Terrible. Nothing was going to make it a good time. Nothing was going to make it. Trying to figure out what's the best we can do with this horrifyingly awful situation that they've had to go through. And I personally think that based on the way that the law was written when I read it, that I don't think it's that ambiguous. I don't think it's that vague. I don't think it's very specific to only very certain kind of things. I think it gives room for a doctor to say, if this is inescapably what we're facing, and if we allow it to continue to go on as it's going on, then you are going to be in peril, and certainly major bodily functions are going to be at risk, then we need to be able to proceed. Under the law, without getting into a greater discussion beyond that, they should have had the clarity to do that. So again, no one is denying the tragedy of what these situations are. As a matter of fact, we're embracing the idea that we have a responsibility and duty to find some way to help people that are facing these situations, and that we have to write clear laws so that people understand the boundaries in which they're allowed to act as medical professionals. But more often than not, when I read these things, I don't walk away with things, oh, these laws are terrible. What I walk away from is thinking these doctors are hiding behind what they're claiming are vague languages or misunderstandings of the law in order to not risk lawsuit or their own licenses. And self-preservation is a natural instinct, and I get it. But your doctor, you're supposed to have, we had an episode here where we had Christopher Tolleson come on and talk about his book, The Way of Medicine, where they talked about we have to look at the medical profession as a calling. You're called to cure, you're called to treat. You are called to look after the best interest of your patient. They are to come first. You are to give them the best treatment that you possibly can within the confines of your medical knowledge and your profession, and you should not be hiding like some service provider that's worried that they're going to lose everything if they... It's just tiring. Look, I get it. You were unclear. You had 3 days to get clear. This happened on Tuesday. You gave the diagnosis. You let her almost die on Friday. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Get clear. Go get clarity. Find out what you can do to help this person. If that's what you would do if you cared. To me, at least that's what I think you would do. If I knew somebody was out there facing what this person was facing and I were their medical doctor, I would be out there trying to find out what I could do to help them. I wouldn't have sent them home by themselves and said, just play it out and see what happens. I'll help you if it gets bad. Because then I have no choice. Ugh. All right. Play the last video.
This past year and a half has clearly been devastating when it comes to abortion rights. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about the, quote, unintended consequences around wanted pregnancies.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the intended ones for unwanted pregnancies too. An abortion is a medical decision between a patient and their doctor, full stop. And it is maddening to see some push to make their states safe for little babies while also making it far more dangerous for the people they grow up to be. But the hope here...
Full stop. It's a medical decision. Abortion's a medical procedure. This is about medicine. Except it isn't. Now, he has brought up medical issues. And we need... I think he's operating in good faith, at least to some degree or another, by bringing these up. Because they're tough issues and we have to deal with them. And I don't resent people bringing these up. These are extreme issues, and all law struggles at the extreme. All of them do. When we're talking about medical exceptions, all law struggles to grasp our responsibility and duties to one another when we get to these exceptions, to these extremes, to these fringe issues, to these outliers, because the law is made to govern the middle, the most often thing that we're dealing with. That's where the law comes into it. We have stoplights and stop signs to stop us on our way because that governs normal flow of traffic. But sometimes we have to have the ability to move faster and to get through those, and laws at the level when we get to exceptions are crafted for those reasons. exceptions. So to bring up exceptions, I think is perfectly legitimate. And especially exceptions that are painful and awful for the people that are enduring them, as the stories we've heard about today are. These people need help, the best help that we can possibly give them. They deserve our love, and they deserve for us to care for them in the most merciful way we possibly can. I am not required to violate my most precious held principles of how we treat other human beings in order to love somebody else. I'm required to be creative in how I find mercy and love for them, and also to operate within the confines of the law as they were established by particular states. And in that particular state, Texas, which we kept returning to over and over and over again, even though we were supposed to be talking about abortion in general around the entire country, in that particular case, it still appears to be that the doctors were not acting in good faith, and that the laws as they were written were able to offer more opportunities for intervention than were given. But maybe I'm wrong about that. But here's the thing. As we wrestle with these extreme cases, it's most important to realize where we end up. Where John Oliver says, this is not the reason that abortion should be legal. He says intended pregnancies or unintended pregnancies or intended abortions or unintended abortions, it doesn't matter. All abortion is a medical issue that ought to be in the realm of privacy between a woman and her doctor. Here's the problem I have with that. They're not all medical. The ones that we talked about today are. All those ones that we discussed today were medical issues, but they're not all medical. As a matter of fact, the overwhelming majority of reason that people get abortions are for reasons of elective reasons, meaning they didn't have any medical issue that required them to get abortion. There were no psychological issues that were requiring them to get abortion. It wasn't rape. It wasn't incest. It wasn't medical malformity. It wasn't a psychological breakdown. So it was none of those things. The overwhelming majority of reasons that people get abortions is because they don't want to be pregnant. They just don't want to have a child. That's the overwhelming majority of them. When you look at that, let me find, I've got I believe a Charlotte Lozier Institute, a pro-life organization, has a pie graph here that I'm looking at. 95.7% of abortions were given for either elective reasons or unspecified. I didn't want to be pregnant. I didn't want it to interfere with school. I didn't want it to interfere with my job. I already have a kid. This is not medical. Now, just because the means by which abortion is performed can be defined as medical doesn't mean that the reasons for abortion are medical, and it doesn't mean that abortion in and of itself is medical full stop, as he would like to say. I don't think that a person who is struggling with psychological dysmorphia and hates their body and believes that they were supposed to be born or supposed to be a paraplegic. There are people out there that believe they're supposed to not have functioning legs. I don't believe it's a medical procedure to go and cut their legs off for them. That's an elective use of surgery to deal with a psychological problem. And that's far worse what they're dealing with than what we're talking about with a lot of the people that reasons they're getting abortion. I remember having read articles where women admitted to having gotten abortions for very trivial reasons for wanting to go on a cruise and to make sure that they were able to drink freely and enjoy themselves on that cruise. And that is an equally legitimate reason to get an abortion in John Oliver's mind as the issues that we've talked about today. Tragic, terrible things that have happened to people. Nobody wants anyone to suffer. Unfortunately, going back to what Kaylee, the first woman that was there that was talking about, she said, how could you craft a law that would require a child that was born to suffer like that? They're trying to craft a law that protects life as best as they can. And I already talked about it. It sounds like the suffering at this point was going to be unavoidable because of the tragedy that befell you and your family. Nobody's crafting law to intentionally make anyone suffer. They're crafting law for the purposes of creating a life-affirming society that doesn't begin by telling us that the next generation's birth is an option to us and that we're allowed to allow it or disallow it based on extremely important reasons like that were raised today or based on trivial reasons, which appear to be the overwhelming majority of reasons why people get abortions. Even if you don't want to say it's trivial, we know that you don't have to get an abortion to satisfy the demands of most of the reasons that people are getting abortion. It's not medical necessity, full stop. It's elective reasons that they're getting abortions, and the practice of abortion itself may require some medical means to make it happen, to get to the ends of an aborted life. But that doesn't mean that the reasons that we're getting abortion is medical. And it doesn't mean that the abortion decision is medical, full stop. Because it's an elective procedure that doesn't have to happen 95% of the time, according to Charlotte Lozer. So yeah, let's say they're way high, 90, 85. Either way, the things that we're talking about today may require us to be creative to deal with it, but that is not how we deal with all abortion. And you can't say because of a few exceptions where they are terribly difficult to deal with, that require deep empathy and how we understand what other human beings are having to endure because of problems that they never wanted to face and pregnancies that they wanted to have a healthy child within and are now trying to figure out the best thing that they can do with the bad situation that they're confronting. This is not in any way the same as what we're talking about as abortion is practiced normally. These are different things altogether. And he uses these terrible things to leverage permissive laws across the board. Let's go back to Germany, by the way. Far more permissive than Germany, far more permissive than England, far more permissive than almost everybody else in the world that allows abortion. United States laws are far more permissive where they are permissive. And the restrictions that people are passing are oftentimes in line with other places that have pre-existing abortion laws, that places that we think of in terms of less puritanical and more enlightened than we are. And they have more restrictive abortion laws. But in the United States, they're going to leverage the worst things that happen to other human beings in pregnancy in an effort to try to excuse everything that's going on all the time as it pertains to permissive abortion laws. I don't think that's necessary. I think we're being offered a false dilemma. Let all pregnancy end in abortion for any reason that a woman wants to protect these extreme cases over here from ever having to have these sorts of fights. Or we're just confronted with terrible things from here on out, with people struggling with having to publicly get permission to get personal, horrible choices on pregnancies that have gone wrong. That's a false dilemma. That's not the options that we have. Let's deal with them separately then. If that's what you're worried about, then let's deal with those as best we possibly can. Let's find some level of agreement about what we think is reasonable about how we will let doctors operate within the confines of these kind of situations, without then saying, by extension, then let women get abortions for any reason they want, or for no reason at all, just simply because they don't want to get pregnant. He thinks all reasons are good reasons to get abortion. And even though the restrictive laws seem to be only making problems in those particular areas, I'm sure he'd be able to give you all sorts of other hysterical reasons that we ought to be able to be worried about those things. But I still think at the end of the day, however funny I think he is, and I still do think he's a funny guy, that he hasn't given us a good reason to believe that abortion ought to be legal everywhere all the time, the way that it was prior to Dobbs versus Jackson. They haven't given me a great reason to be terrified about what's going on in Arizona. I don't feel like there's a great reason to be hysterical about the effects of these laws, not because I think the laws themselves can't be improved. They probably can, but because I see most of the problem right now is bad doctors. Bad doctors. That until we deal with that, then I'm not particularly worried about, how the law, because we've read the laws. I'll read them all. We can read them all day here on this show and figure out if the laws themselves are the problem or if the execution of those laws and a medical practice are the problem. So far, I'm leaning towards the execution of what rights those doctors have by those doctors who are afraid more for their career than they are for the woman sitting in front of them, because not just because they won't do the procedures, but because of the other things that they do, like sending that woman home. Wait till you get sick to come back. And making no effort to figure out if there was more that they could have done in the 3 days. I want to say this as I end talking about this. I hope that I have not been insensitive about what has happened to those people, because everything I have said has been meant to recognize the terrible situations that they have found themselves in, to recognize that they were afraid, to recognize that these were people that did not want abortions, that these were people that had terrible situations thrusted on them by circumstances outside of their control, that were looking for and desiring a medical professional to guide them through their options at this point. And I have said, I think based on the things that I've seen, that the medical professionals were more of a failure than the laws that govern them. That's just my view from the outside looking in. I could be wrong about this, but I don't feel like I am based on some of the circumstantial evidence that we see involved in those things. And that no person in a perfect world would ever have to endure what those people had to go through. We have to remember that these are real human beings dealing with terrible things. And as I cling to the idea that all human beings matter and ought to be treated with dignity and respect, they belong in the category of human beings that matter and ought to be treated with dignity and respect. I don't like the idea of their tragedy being leveraged to try to give allowance or permission to things that have nothing to do with it. I don't like the idea of their tragedy and the things that have befallen them being used to excuse the behavior of bad doctors and to be able to condemn laws that don't seem to be what they're being portrayed as in the media, or even on that particular show where we had a lot of detail in certain areas. Those are arguments from misery. They are compelling, but they're not a great way to set normal laws for all people to adhere to in all times, because they're operating in the extremes. And I think that at the end of the day, that we have to be clear that no matter what decisions that we make, we are going to face hard choices. And that the best that we can do is to try our hardest to figure out how to love every human being involved in these hard choices to the best of our ability as a community. And we need to take that challenge seriously. And that only reason that we are now talking about these terrible things that happen to these terrible people is that they have allowed themselves to be publicly used to leverage certain political positions. And so we have to look at what happened to them. I am not a fan of doxing people. I don't like bringing people out that have no interest in being seen or talked about, and I would never do so. Every situation that I brought up and talked about with any detail as far as the names of the people that were involved with it and all the details, they were shared by CNN, by the New Yorker, by HBO, by all of these different people. And so I wanted to address them as they were laid out. I think that these are terribly personal and private things that ought not to have been pulled out like that. But if they want to bring them out for the purpose of discussing them, then we have to understand the full context of what happened to these people. In both of the major cases that John Oliver brought up, we were talking about people who had past terrible experiences with trying to get pregnant and trying to have a healthy pregnancy, and both of them ended in tragedy. And I am grateful to God that both of those women survived what they went through and didn't face worse than what they already faced. But in both cases, we are dealing with outliers, not normal, not the normal case of how pregnancy progresses. And we don't craft law based on outliers. Never have, never should. So that's our show for today. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being a part of the Human Things podcast. If you are one of the people who listen because you hate me, thank you. Keep listening. I love hate listeners. If you like the material that we're producing, we pray and ask that you consider giving financial gifts at our website. You can go and give there under donate, or you can mail them into our ministry. We have so many interesting things coming up. We're going to have a discussion about the conflict of cultures and the conflict of civilizations, framed around Thomas Sowell's book on that issue. We have a conversation coming up about just war, coming up right around the corner. I keep promising that one. I got the guy coming in. More students coming in to experience our new table in our new room with our new cameras. And we have that being set up, and they're coming. Lots of guests coming. I might just invite people to show up. That's coming up. You know who I got permission from in my mind, JD? I saw an interview with Orson Welles, one of the great filmmakers responsible for making Citizen Kane. So no, Orson Welles is dead. He's not coming here. So long dead. But what he said was, he was asked, did you ever cast a friend in a role simply because they're your friend? And he said, frequently. And they said, did it ever backfire? And he said, frequently. And they asked him, would you do it again? And he said, absolutely. Because he said this, I thought this was great. He said, as I've already mentioned, I did not place a high value on art, on film as art. He said other people did, and I admire them for that, but I did not. And what he was saying as he discussed it was, I liked making movies, and I wanted to make them with my friends because I thought the creative process ought to be enjoyable as well. And so I cared less that the movie had the highest exhibition of its artistic merit possible than I did that we just told a fun story and that we did it in a process that was fun and enjoyable for everybody. And that gave me permission to invite some of my friends to come in here and enjoy it, a conversation with us. So in the places where we are going to, sometimes I had to convince a friend of mine, it's like, look, you're authority enough. Come in and talk to us. We're going to have conversations with my friends. Every one of them I'm going to bring on. They're going to be people that know what they're talking about, but we're going to be more liberal in the idea of who we allow to come on, because sometimes chasing scholars down just isn't the easiest thing to do in the world. And then I'm hoping a couple of the guys that had a good time talking to us will come back. All of that coming up in future episodes. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless.